immigration, at least as we talk about it in labor markets, so in its economic sense, is just a subset of the normal case for comparative advantage in trade. So free international trade, economists, gets more support among economists than pretty much any other issue because that people can engage in what's their comparative advantage and we're all wealthier. But not all goods and services are perfectly mobile. In fact, most services aren't. Increasingly in the world today, services are able to be traded internationally. So you can have your x-rays read in India by a physician over there rather than having it read locally because we can beam stuff back and forth, and you can have call centers in different places. But lots of services have to be performed on site by their very nature. If we had perfectly free trade in goods and services, perfectly mobile capital, and perfectly mobile natural resources, and everybody all had the same quality institutions, then the question of labor mobility would be moot, because the resources would move, the capital would move to where the best match with labor is, and then the goods and services would flow from that. We don't live in that world. We don't have perfectly free trade in goods and services. We don't have perfectly mobile capital. By definition, a lot of resources, natural resources, are fixed in place. And institutions are vastly different around the world. That means then that there's a big role for free trade and labor to be able to play in making us all wealthier in the world. But the free trade and labor is just a subset of the comparative advantage for free trade in goods and services. The economics behind it are exactly the same. You want people to be able to move their labor where it can create the greatest value. If you don't have mobile labor, you cannot do that. So labor restrictions, namely the borders that politicians have drawn on maps that restrict our labor mobility, are making us poorer. And while a lot of ink has been spilt, or keys have been typed as the case may be, on the case for free trade, the world has improved post-1947 or so, moving more and more towards free trade, although it's not free trade, and you should still be skeptical anytime you see free trade agreement and it's more than like one page. It means there's a bunch of freaking rent seeking going on. I could do a free trade agreement, it would go something like, I don't tax your stuff, you don't tax mine, I don't quota limit you, you don't quota limit me, and we won't discriminate against each other through regulatory processes. Then maybe you need to legalize that a little bit. But basically it's a couple pages. When you see 5,000 pages, 20,000 page trade agreements, it's basically something that's calling itself free trade, which might in some cases marginally free trade more, sometimes it free trade less. But it's got a whole bunch of rent seeking that basically goes on, and they CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. It exempts sugar, something that clearly the Caribbean has a comparative advantage in producing, so that the Funjul family in southern Florida can maintain their rents, and I'm get stuck drinking Coca-Cola that has corn syrup rather than sugar, because the US has twice the domestic price of sugar. Although I wish I was consuming it today, I'm stuck with Pepsi because we're in the monopoly that is Berkeley, that apparently we can only get Pepsi. But I digress. But you have restrictions on, oh yeah, you can import the clothing, import duty free to the United States if first you take US yarn and string and put it into your clothing from there, and there's all this other stuff. That said, I think the weight of the evidence is, post-1947 till now, through first GATT and then the WTO, which has plenty of problems, including the constant drive to put labor standards into it, mostly by wealthy first world countries while third world countries oppose it. The evidence is trade has freed greatly over that time period, and we're wealthier as a result of it. But while we continue to advocate for free trade, and I think that's important, it pales in comparison to the importance of freeing trade and labor. But yet much less work by economists, and for that matter others, has been done on the case for that. So Michael Clemens is an excellent economist who works a lot on immigration. He had a great article, it was called $1 Trillion Bills on the Sidewalk. It's a spoof on an economist joke, which is two economists are walking down the sidewalk, and one's the young guy, one's the old guy. By the way, it's not going to be funny because it's an economics joke. And they're walking down the sidewalk, and the young economist is like, look, there's a $100 bill. And the old economist is like, no, there's not. If there was, it would have already been picked up. So it's like an equilibrium always notion of economics, of markets, as opposed to markets, a process of adjustment where you can actually pick up those bills. So it's a kind of crappy joke. Anyway, his spoof on it was $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. And it was about the gains to the world economy by increasing migration flows from poorer countries to wealthier countries. And he put together the consensus estimates of how much wealthier the world would be if we went from the current policy to absolute free trade in goods and services and in capital. Add them all up, you get a few percent of world GDP. Non-trivial in a $60 trillion world, but it's still a few percent. If you allowed for free labor mobility with current estimates of how many people would move, you get 50% to 150% estimates of what would happen to world GDP. That's in a snapshot efficiency time, not like a dynamic growth over time. Like if we could just move poor people out of their poor countries and into richer countries, with the number of them that would want to go, 50% to 150% of world GDP. 30 to 90 trillion dollars. This is massive. And it just dwarfs anything we could get from basically any other policy in terms of making the world a wealthier place. Even if you only did a 5% migration in the world, 5% of the world's poor move to wealthier countries. Certainly that's more doable in terms of politically. Even that dwarfs any of the gains you could get from freeing all trade and goods and services and capital. Just a 5% migration. The gains here are massive. But yet it's the blowback from rich countries that prevent this from happening. If you want to talk about, so someone raised the question about the legacy of colonialism and exploitation, of maybe we got wealthy because of the empires, or whatever. If we want to talk about how the first world is actively screwing people in the world today and making them poor, it's immigration restrictions. If our government, I almost said we, but I don't. We should never mistake us for the government. I have never bombed anybody in Afghanistan, so we did not do that. The US government that stomps on my rights has stomped on other people's rights. The US government has put up borders that prevent people from coming into our country. That is they're actively screwing poor people in the world today. In fact, that's the probably most egregious screwing of poor people in the world today. And it's not making them poorer in their home country, it's making them poorer because they can't come to make best use of their labor, which would make them better off and incidentally, us better off. So what I'd like to start with then is progress through a few of the arguments that people raise about why we should not allow greater immigration into the United States. And then I'll progress into some of the more problematic aspects of immigration, because it's not strictly an economic issue. The first of these is, okay, fine, the world can get 150% richer. But it's all just for the poor people. It's because they're going to come here and they're going to make us poorer, but they're going to get wealthier. Now, it is true that the lion's share of the gains are going to accrue to the immigrant who actually moves, but it doesn't make the United States poorer. In fact, these first three things I'm going to tell you. So you guys tell me, what are the three biggest objections that you hear? You don't have to believe these personally, or you can, I don't care. What are the three biggest objections to more open immigration in the United States you hear?
They steal our jobs.
Yeah, that's the South Park one. They steal our jobs. Yeah.
Xenophobia.
Xenophobia. Okay. People usually don't like to say that one. That's it underlies the other things they say. It what?
It creates drag on the economy.
It's going to pull down our economy. You know, I've seen Lou Dobbs he's like, they want us to turn into a third world economy. And in fact, actually, he mentioned that I was on Dobbs before. When I was on Dobbs, he called me a jackass and an idiot because I advocated free trade and labor. Yeah.
It's going to let terrorists come in.
Okay, terrorists, we'll deal with them later.
They're going to just reach off our welfare state.
Fiscal, okay, they're going to reach off our welfare state. I'll get to that one in a few minutes. I guess the big three in economics I hear is they're going to destroy our economy, they're going to steal our jobs, and they're going to push down our wages. Those are kind of the big three that you get from economics. Then you get these other ones, the terrorists, the underlying xenophobia, and some of the other things that you all brought up. So let's deal with the first three, because actually the first three are kind of uncontroversial among economists. So economists basically agree, or at least economists who study immigration, that they make our country wealthier, they don't steal our jobs, and they don't depress our wages, at least on average, but maybe for some high school dropouts. That's basically consensus. Now, this doesn't mean all economists agree we should have more open immigration. Plenty of economists disagree with that, but their reason for disagreement are not the narrowly economic reasons. It's either the underlying xenophobia or some of these other issues that go on. So these firstly, George Borjas, ironically an immigrant himself, this is kind of like an immigrant disease, it seems. When they work on immigration, they're bad on immigration. So Borjas isn't alone in this. Brimlow would be in that camp. Hans Hoppe would be in this camp. So it's not even just libertarians or whatever. Anyhow, Borjas is an economist at Harvard. He's a prominent immigration economist. He's done lots of just good mainstream economic work on this, and he opposes more open immigration. But in his own research, what he writes is that they're a net benefit to our economy. Using his methodology, updating it to today's immigrant flows, it puts it at about $40 billion a year net benefit to the native-born population of the immigrants who are in the country. So 40 billion, hey, 40 billion, I wouldn't mind having it, but it's pretty small as a percent of a $13 trillion economy. So what Borjas says is, hey, so that's all we'd be giving up if we just completely close the borders, and we should do that for all these other reasons, so we shouldn't let the economic benefits get in the way. But what he's not saying is, they're destroying our economy, and that's a reason to get rid of them. He's saying, I admit they're a benefit, but it's not a big benefit. Now, of course, one reason that estimate is low, well, actually one is a particular methodology. You can use other methodologies, but even still, you can get up into the hundreds of billions, but you don't get into the letter T's, no matter whose estimates you look at. So as a percent of our economy, immigration as currently constructed is a modest benefit to the native-born population. But a couple big reasons for that. One is we quantitatively limit how many can come in. If more came in, we could get more benefit. Two, the current mix of immigrants that are in here does not reflect the economic realities of the ones that we most need. So we don't have a matching with the different quota systems that you have. There's a continual mismatch between supply and demand of workers needed. So we're not getting what we need the most. Three, a lot of the immigrants who came here illegally. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the worker, but their mere illegal status prevents them often from making the best use of their labor in the country, so we get less out of them because of that. So these estimates could get bigger if we let more people in and let them be legal workers so that they could resort in the economic environment better. Even still, saying that this is going to make the United States tremendously wealthy, no. But doing it worldwide and letting the poor people's welfare count, it is going to be probably the most massive wealth creating thing that you could do of any economic policy. Next is jobs. So they're going to steal our jobs. Just think about this for a second. It doesn't matter whether they're an immigrant or not. The idea here is almost like that there's a fixed pool of jobs. You add more people in, you take away jobs from the others. But if I was doing PowerPoint, I'd have a slide like this. But what's happened, let's say 1950, 2013, to number of people in the labor force in the United States. Who's entered the labor force? Massive entry. Women, massive entry of women into the labor force, baby boomers, and post-65 more immigrants. We've roughly, I don't know if we're here, roughly doubled the size of the labor force. If we had a fixed pool of jobs, what would the unemployment rate look like? 50%. Now, we do have high unemployment right now at like, what, 8% is current rate, something like that. More related to our boneheaded policy, excuse me, I said the US government's boneheaded policies in response to the recession that have made, and by the way, I don't think we're in a slow recovery now. I think what we're witnessing is the new reality of the long-term growth trend of the United States, given the deterioration of institutions that happened largely in response to the crisis. So it's not about recovery anymore, it's just the realities become bad. But anyway, that has nothing to do with an increase in the size of the labor force. Basically, we have no long-term structural unemployment from having more people. Instead, what you see, total civilian employment versus the size of the labor force, tracks like that right now, we're one of the little down blips more. But it's business cycle. But basically, you double both of them over the same time. So as you add more people, you create more jobs. I think what you have going on here is a mistake. It's a classic of Bastiat of the seen and the unseen. It's easy to stick a TV camera on someone who's lost their job that an immigrant is now doing. I used to do landscaping, I can't anymore. There's immigrants who have outcompeted me, and I no longer have a job there. Okay, that's the scene. You can put a camera on that guy. What you don't see is that the immigrants also create demands that additional jobs need to come about to satisfy them. And what you don't see is that this labor is getting re-employed in other places that are being created around the economy. It might not be this particular worker. He might fill in for somebody else in a job that existed, but this one graduated to an entirely other profession. But you don't have a one-to-one mapping of that's the one that got job that was able to be filled because there was an immigrant here that freed up someone 10 steps away in the labor market. So it's just a perception thing of seen and unseen. It's also fashionable for people in this debate to be like, yeah, immigrants do the jobs that Americans won't do. And then someone will retort, yeah, but that's because we just don't pay Americans enough. If we paid them enough, they'd do it. Fair enough. But that doesn't tell you whether the job would exist if it paid more. So we have examples of various crops. Arizona was a lettuce crop not too long ago that they couldn't harvest because they couldn't get enough labor in. Now, they could have bid up wages high enough to get US workers to come do it. Instead, they chose to leave, I think it was 2/3 of the crop in the ground and rot, and they took losses of about $4 billion. Because if they had bid the price of US labor up high enough to harvest it, their losses would have been even bigger than $4 billion. So it's not that they're depressing the wages, it's the job simply wouldn't exist if it had to exist at higher wages because it doesn't create enough value. It's also the case that many of the jobs would have gone overseas had there not been immigration here. Bill Gates, for one, has said at the high-end level, he's like, I'd outsource fewer jobs overseas if I could get more people in under H-1B. That's the skilled worker visa program. At the same time, you look at the garment industry. I think it's 1/3 of garment workers in the United States are immigrants to the country. More of those jobs would have gone. Oh, and I'm not saying that's bad, by the way. It's perfectly fine if those jobs go overseas for international trade reasons, comparative advantage. But part of why they go is because we don't have free trade in labor to bring labor here when it would be more efficient to do it here. So like it's comparative advantage constrained by an unfree market in labor that's mucking it up. So a lot of these jobs simply wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the immigrants anyway. So what about wages? So Journal of Economic Perspectives is an economics journal. It's kind of weird to say this. It's an economics journal that was designed for economists so they could talk to other economists because they're such poor communicators that they don't even communicate well outside of their subdisciplines. So it's basically like, so the labor economist can say something that the monetary economists understand and vice versa. So it's supposed to kind of like summarize the research in your field, but you get your own spin on it too. So it's not just like a literature review, but a literature review plus. So this one, it's a little while ago now, but it did a survey on immigration, and it said, this is the conclusion, quote, despite the popular belief that immigrants have a large adverse impact on the wages and employment opportunities of the native-born population, the literature on this question does not provide much support for the conclusion. So wages don't go down, jobs don't get on net stolen, is kind of what the whole field is finding. The exception is maybe the least skilled. This is where the debate is. So overall, you don't find any wage depression, but of high school dropouts in the United States, the estimates there vary. Some actually find a slight positive effect of immigration on their wages. At most, I think it's Borhaus's estimate that was -8%. So that's the most negative they find. It's just within high school dropouts, and there it's debatable. How can this be possible? So actually, most of you have taken an econ course. What does supply and demand tell you about this? So incidentally, by the way, I get hate mail a lot, but I get the lion's share of hate mail anytime I write on immigration. Compared to doing, actually what I wish I could do though, is take like my sweatshops columns and my immigration columns and like get the people who just write hateful comments to like have to see each other's comments about me, and like their little heads would explode. Because it's like, because one is like, liberal apologist, politically correct academic, what a, and the other one's like neo-corporatist shrill who believes in capitalism. And like, guys, talk to each other. It's especially bad because as much as you get crappy comments on blogs and to newspaper columns, when you do like the YouTube videos, because now you don't even have to like pass the bar of being able to read a column for 5 minutes before writing a comment. You just like write illiterately right away. Well, I got one guy who sent me a hate mail on this, and I usually don't respond to the hate mail. I usually just delete it. But in this particular case, I responded because I had had a few cocktails and didn't have anything else to do that night. And the first one was pretty sassy, but we went back and forth a few times, actually, and he became more reasonable in his questions. And I was pointing out to him all the different kind of economic studies and stuff of why this doesn't happen. His basic complaint to me was he had taken one economics course once, and he told me that I didn't believe in supply and demand, which is kind of an interesting thing to accuse an economist of. To his credit, actually, then at the end of this hateful exchange, kind of, it wasn't hateful, this exchange, he's like, can I post all of this on my website dedicated to immigration? So I had to go back and particularly read the very first reply I wrote to him. Be like, yeah, okay, that's fine, post it all, except you just have to include this, you can't edit a word, and you have to post this paragraph in full where I just kind of give my summary position. I'm like, and feel free to post it in whatever commentary you want. And in it, I linked to a whole bunch of like economics literature on this stuff. And his title, he told me it was going to be called Economist Denies the Laws of Supply and Demand. Instead, it became Economics Profession Denies the Laws of Supply and Demand. So he was not to be deterred. But his basic point was this. He's like, listen, you have a supply of labor, a demand for labor. Immigration is an increase in the supply of labor. Supply plus immigration. He's like, so I get it. Listen, total number of jobs increases. So on net, they're not going to steal our jobs. He's like, but look, wages have to go down. It's supply and demand. Don't you get it? Incidentally, by the way, when he published this, it's the only time I've ever been featured on a neo-Nazi website. But because he didn't like me, I was okay with it. So why isn't this the end of the story? Yeah?
Will demand also shifts?
Yeah, One. So usually like when people screw up supply and demand, the classic phrase is, right, ceteris paribus. We hold everything else constant. So someone will be like, well, this happens, and well, we'll just have something else happen at the same time, and look, nothing. Well, the partial effect, the actual effect of the policy was to do exactly, say, push down wages or whatever. But in the case of immigration, we're not violating ceteris paribus. By definition, we have to be moving both curves, almost by definition. Immigrants don't come and consume nothing. In fact, actually, if they did that, it'd be pretty cool, right? Just show up and serve us and take nothing in return. We'll give you pieces of paper that you don't do anything with. In fact, actually, by the way, this whole thing, when I was talking about international trade, when people talk about trade and like the good thing being jobs and stuff, they got the whole thing like inverted. If we could do international trade where we really could run a trade deficit where we just sent them pieces of paper and they sent us goods and services, how cool would that be? We could all just like go down to Santa Cruz right now, hang out on the beach, they'll just drop shit off on the shore, we'll consume it, and it'll be great. We give them pieces of paper. But we don't. What we care about is the goods and services, not the jobs. Jobs, by the way, good smell test for someone who's a bad economist or not an economist. Anytime they list jobs as a benefit of anything, jobs are not a benefit, they're a cost. They're the bad thing we have to do in order to get the goods and services we want to consume. Yes, we don't want to be jobless, but it's because we need the job to earn the money to get the other stuff. The job is a bad, that's why your employer pays you to do it. You don't pay them for the privilege of getting to do the activity. Any event, the immigrants, when they come here, they don't just give us our services, they also demand services back from us, which means, so not only is there going to be a greater supply of labor, there's going to be a greater demand of labor. Now I could draw it just like that, and the net effect is nothing. The wages are the same. That doesn't have to be, though. It becomes an empirical question, not an a priori economic law of more immigration, wages must go down. It could be the immigrants who come also bring their savings and want to spend on other stuff, and demand is even farther out. Wages go up. It could be that they come and they give us goods and services, but they don't consume as much. Demand is increased, but not enough to completely offset. Where it lies is an empirical question, not an a priori one. It doesn't mean you're violating the laws of supply and demand. So that's one reason why this is not true, but it's only one. What are some other reasons why it's not true? Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of immigrant-owned businesses, so to a certain degree they create jobs.
Okay, so that's a different version of like create a demand for jobs, is because they come in, and this is actually kind of cool about immigrants when they come in as entrepreneurs. A disproportionate number tend to be entrepreneurs. I think part of the reason is because like the $50 bill or $100 bill joke on the sidewalk is partially true. When profit opportunities pop up, people tend to grab them, but then new profit opportunities pop up and it's like a continual churning of it. But you have to be able to like see the profit opportunity, and entrepreneurs from foreign countries come with, like, or just people from different countries come with like a different set of eyeglasses. So things that we walk past and don't see, they come with a baggage and a history that gives them a different prescription. They're like, oh, I see, I could do X and create value. So in the process, they create some jobs as they're creating this new service that creates value for people, sure. Other ones. How about, is it the supply of labor? Is this just a single market? Do the immigrants look exactly like us? No. Immigrants, go ahead.
They introduce new markets.
They might introduce new markets, but I'm just thinking about the skill set they bring right now. Yeah.
They're either really high skilled or really low skilled.
Yeah.
So it's like a bell curve.
Yeah, in fact, if we were going to be like high and low, it's more like, it's like an hourglass, right? There's a lot of very high-skilled ones, like a disproportionate number of PhD. If we're willing to call PhDs high-skilled, which some of my family members would disagree, they just call you like you're the type of doctor who can't help somebody. But if we're willing to say that PhDs are high-skilled, the disproportionate number are foreign-born. At the same time, a disproportionate number of people without a high school diploma are also immigrants. What's the U.S. labor force look like? If I was going to put a shape to it, it'd be more like a diamond. Most of them have a high school degree. Most of them have some college, maybe a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. Very few are at the very top of the pyramid, very few at the very bottom of the pyramid, at least proportionally. But now, like, stick these two shapes together, and are we talking about the supply of labor? We're talking about different supplies of labor. So the question is complements versus substitutes. Do the workers come in substitute for American labor, or do they complement it? Basically, do they bring skills different than our own that allow us to specialize in our comparative advantage more, and them to specialize in their comparative advantage more, that makes us all wealthier? If that's the case, there's no reason to see wages go down. So they're basically, and by the way, this goes with standard, standard way you do analysis in international trade and comparative advantage of Same thing happening here. Labor is going to match with labor that's unlike it, where you get the greatest gains from trade. So all of our wealth can go up. There's no reason why our wages have to go down when it frees up Americans from, people will say, oh, we want the high-skill immigrants, but not the low-skilled ones. But the low-skill ones contribute to our high-skill outputs in the United States no less than the high-skill ones do directly. Sure, a high-skilled immigrant can come who's a brain surgeon. But a low-skilled immigrant who comes and mows the lawn and does the dishes and cleans the house of a US-born brain surgeon, so that that guy doesn't spend his weekends doing that but does more brain surgeries, that immigrant increased the number of brain surgeries in the United States just as much as a high-skilled immigrant does. That's the nature of comparative advantage and gains from trade. The fact that more wealthy, productive people in the United States don't have maids, cleaning services, and yard services constrains how much value they can create in their other jobs. It constrains their leisure, people see that, but it also constrains how much productive time that they can put into their jobs where they can actually create more value. Go to a poorer country, so like Guatemala is one I mentioned that I was in earlier. Go to upper middle class person there, and you'll find that they all have yard service, they all have domestic maids who do cooking, they have, because the cost of the labor is so low. But the gains that they get from that are so much smaller than the gains that the United States could get, because the disparity between the high-skilled and the low-skilled of like what we have in terms of the size of the pool in the United States versus there is massive. So why is it that people who are on an objective standard much poorer than upper middle class America having a fleet of servants while we're not? It's a labor restriction, and that's impeding us doing what's in our comparative advantage. So we want the low-skilled as much as we want the high-skilled. People are only seeing half the benefit, a small part of the benefit that low-skilled labor provides. Finally, another reason, by the way, is just that specialization, classic Adam Smith, specialization in the division of labor, so narrowly specializing in what our comparative advantage is, and it's kind of what I was just saying, is limited by the extent of the market. So the more thick our market is, the more narrow we can specialize into finer and finer niches. It's why when you drive through, Kansas, you don't see a superly refined market compared to when you're in New York City. Now, Kansas is actually pretty refined in its division of labor because it's integrated into a free trade economy across all of the United States and largely into other parts of the world. But still, you get a benefit of density of bringing more people together where you could just have greater specialization and division of labor. So that's another reason why wages don't have to go down. So when we look at this then, and look at the wage, what we find is no evidence of wage depression for natives, except among some of the least skilled, and that's basically this part here, where they're acting as substitutes. Across the rest of the range, we're not finding it. So I think a disproportionate amount of the debate about immigration in the United States centers around things that basically all economists who study immigration can largely agree on, which is that it doesn't take our jobs on net, doesn't make us poorer. Where the debate among economists would be was how big is the effect on the least skilled people in the United States, the high school dropouts. That's basically it. And unfortunately, I think that's what too many people spend their time debating in the public realm. So when I give this talk to like a Kiwanis club or something like that, I usually kind of wrap it up shortly thereafter. Like, if any three of these have been your objection to immigration, you should become, at least on the margin, more open to more immigration now. It could be that you have other reservations that you don't want to be a complete open borders guy, that's fine. But to the extent that you believed in one of these myths, your position on the margin should be moving more towards greater immigration flows. I do think it's also worthwhile, we're still on the narrowly economic part of it, talking about immigration as foreign aid. So foreign aid, of course, is a disaster in government-to-government programs and promoting development. I ended my last talk talking about how it's hard to reform institutions in other parts of the world, and it has to be a homegrown process. Well, there's an alternative. The obvious alternative, if you can't export good institutions, is let the people come to the good institutions, or the relatively good institutions, I should say. Like when we talk about economic freedom in America, by the way, the direction is grossly wrong. As recently as 2000, we were the second freest economy in the world, and now we're down to like 18th, and it's going to be lower in the next ranking. That's so, even though when we're talking like 2000, I view this as like kind of like tallest dwarf type thing, like, yeah, you come in second, but you're still a dwarf. We could be much freer, and it's sad that we're not. In any event, our relatively better institutions compared to these countries, let them come here and then make better use of their capital. I mean, think of what the most ambitious development program could ever do for Haiti. And then think what happens to the income of a Haitian when they move from Haiti to the United States. It's a big increase for the least skilled Haitians that come to the United States. can't get a development program that's going to, it's a factor, I think it's like a factor of 7 or 8 that their income goes up. Maybe it's even more than that. It's a big boost. You're never going to get a development. Now, some people might be like, yeah, but then Haiti's not developing. Like, who cares? Haiti's a hunk of land. We don't like run around being like, Antarctica doesn't have enough GDP. It's penguins, who cares? You care about the humanity that's on a piece of land. And if the humanity can move off that piece of land to somewhere else and then be wealthy and prosperous, I call that economic development for Haitians. Maybe not for a particular island. I think it counts just as much. And interestingly, some people will respond, well, it's brain drain, though. People are going to leave the country will become poorer. Clemens has done some good work on this, and basically the evidence is it doesn't do much to the country where they come from. Basically, the country where they come from is poor because they've got bad rules and bad governments, or excuse me, particularly bad rules and particularly bad governments. So when the people leave, they weren't making that much use of their human capital there anyway. On net, at least on the aggregate level, you don't pick up like all of a sudden that country's wealth getting poorer because people left. So it's not dooming the others to impoverishment who are back there. You also get then the very real thing of development that does go to those countries, which is remittances. So when these people come and earn more money in a place like the United States, they send some of it home in a way that doesn't get channeled through their own government's corrupt structure that perverts the actual development that goes on. So it's not going to get you sustained development in bad institutions, but it can at least be a shot in the arm to help people's own living standards. So let's talk about some of these other issues associated with it. Taxation and the welfare state. So let's start with this one. Milton Friedman famously said it's just obvious open immigration and the welfare state are incompatible. I largely agree. Unfortunately, I think too many libertarians take from this, or too many otherwise free market people take from this quote, therefore we should oppose immigration. To me, this is so much the worse for the welfare state. The problem is spillover costs with the welfare state, whether they're domestic people or immigrants. And yes, if you let many poorer immigrants in, it could put a strain on the welfare state. Although I will say, one big aspect of the welfare state is Social Security and Medicaid. And largely the immigrant flows coming in are not old, and they're workers. So to me, actually, one of the negative effects of immigration is probably propping up Social Security's Ponzi scheme for a little bit longer than it would otherwise last. Most people would interpret that as a good thing. Maybe we in this room are slightly different. But to some extent, yes, a welfare state and open immigration are incompatible. But those who argue against the immigration then, to me, are someone who just misunderstands Mises' dynamics of interventionism. They're basically letting one bad policy dictate that we should have more bad policies. And this is why Mises called it middle-of-the-road policy leads to socialism, because you're always going to have unintended, undesirable consequences. And if you keep passing new laws to deal with that, you end up with a command economy. Instead, we need to fight to roll back the existing restrictions, which would be the immigration, rather than saying, therefore, we should support the welfare state. That said, I'd say the evidence thus far on immigration is kind of mixed on this. So there's been National Academy of Science studies that found that immigrants paid more over their lifetime than they consumed in government services. That's a little bit of an old study, and it might not reflect new realities. There's other studies that come out that say they're a fiscal drain. There was one recently by the Heritage Foundation, which was an absolute, complete, and utter fraud. It was political hackery, actually masquerading as economics. They did something in their own they're a big proponent of dynamic scoring. When they're talking about tax cuts, and they are always lambasting statist politicians who don't realize the full benefits of tax cut for not doing dynamic scoring, then precisely what do they drop when they do a study on immigration is the dynamic aspect on the economy, because that's how they can cook the numbers. In any event, there's lots of studies on it. Let's just say, though, for the sake of argument, it comes out that yes, immigrants are a net drain on the fiscal, and it's certainly, by the way, it is the case that local jurisdictions often lose from having high populations of low-skilled immigrants. And it's largely how the taxes get split up, how taxes go to a federal or state level and not funneled back down to the individual district that's tied to the low-skilled immigrants. So it's like hospitals, schools, things like that can get overwhelmed on a fiscal side because of immigration. But none of this, to me, like condemns immigration. To me, this would say, this seems like a bad system of public finance. Even within like current normal bounds, just rearrange your public finance of state-local splits and you can fix that. If it's the case that immigrants consume more over their lifetime in government services than they contribute in taxes, change your fiscal policies towards them, rather than like throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, therefore, no immigration. To me, all of these things are secondary consequences. Basically, if the consensus economics is right that on net we're wealthier, the native-born population is wealthier because immigrants come here, then any drain you can find on a fiscal side, in principle, is solvable because there's a surplus of wealth because of them coming here. So it shouldn't be a net reason for stopping it. It should just be a reshuffling, if that's going to be your reason for objecting it. The terrorist one, I think, is particularly silly. One, because current government policy obviously does a poor job of preventing terrorists from coming in under existing immigration restrictions. Two, you have many years where you have hundreds of millions, where you have 5 million, 500,000 to 1.5 million attempts to cross the Mexican border into the United States. The vast majority of those are not terrorists. They're people who want to come work here. If you're devoting all of your border patrol enforcement into stopping all of them, you're not doing as good a job of just stopping terrorists as you could if you use the same amount of enforcement power. If you instead let all workers in through legal checkpoints, let's assume that you can verify their ID that they're not a terrorist or a known criminal, at least as well as a government could possibly do this, which is fairly poorly anyway. You have a smaller horde to hide among for those who have to try to cross through the desert. So you should be better at interdicting them. Ditto for criminals. If they come here and commit, so most don't commit crimes. Most are productive members of society. For those who, let's say, commit crimes against person and property, not infractions of government legislation that I wouldn't call a crime, but why not just make the offer to come here contingent? If you become a violent criminal against person or property, you get deported. To me, that seems not only a more efficient, but also a more just system than saying, because some of you might become criminals, we're going to put a blanket restriction at the border that none of you can come in. I said this one time and someone's like, well, would you deport US criminals too? I'm like, well, we currently lack in Australia, but for immigrants, when they come here, you do have somewhere you can send them back to. So if this is your objection, why not drop it and just send them back? Voting citizenship, I think, is more problematic. I'm not a big fan that there's 300 million Americans in the United States right now who get to vote for government representatives who are going to create inefficient and unjust laws for me. I'm not, however, convinced that adding more immigrants to it makes what the mob picks for policies any worse. Historically, in the 19th century, the immigrants tended, at least on the national level, to associate with the party of smaller government, which was the Democrats. It's not clear to me which party would be the party of smaller government today. So when people get all riled up like, oh, they'll vote Democratic. Okay, so what's the difference? There has been some recent work done, and it's kind of beginning stages. There were a couple of pieces published by Alex Narasto, who I think does some pretty good work, and it was on the relationship between economic freedom and immigrant flows, and basically showing countries as they receive more immigrants don't deteriorate in economic freedom. It's beginning work, so I'm actually trying to talk to them about scaling it up and doing more. But that would be the objection I think most people would, or free market types is a legitimate worry, is what if immigrants come and pervert the institutions and make us even more or less free? I don't think there's good evidence for it. I think it's just a fear. I think it would be silly, just kind of a priori, to think that that's what they want. They're leaving a statist country that's made them poor, coming to one that they're demonstrating that they like its institutions better. To me, I would be surprised if they came and said, yes, let's make this place like Mexico, like Colombia, pick wherever you came from. But I think it's a legitimate, at least compared to the other objections to immigration, it's one that I think is worth talking about and debating, and more scholarship should be done on. But it's not one that I really personally fear very much. It's also the case, by the way, why do we have to extend citizenship and voting rights? Now, of course, you can influence the polity without having citizenship and voting rights, so it doesn't completely take care of it, but it might on the margin to some extent. So why not just anybody who wants to come here and work, as long as you can find a place to live? And actually, really, you don't even need to find employment. As long as you can find a place to live that you can pay for, or someone will pay for on your behalf, cool, do it. Incidentally, by the way, I'm not an advocate of, quote, immigrant rights. I don't believe in the right to immigrate. I believe in property and boundaries, and my property is my own, and you're not free to immigrate across it. I don't confuse government land for my property, though. I consider it largely unowned property, and that there's a unjust filter right now that violates existing citizens' freedom of association. So it's not that immigrants' rights are violated so much when they can't come onto government land, it's the rights of existing US citizens to freely associate with immigrants from other countries in business or in property relationships. It's existing right holders in the United States who are having their rights violated by this, and indirectly then the immigrants as well. Which is always interesting. By the way, when you come up with like the fiscal drag on this, the people, if they were going to be consistent, who object to the fiscal, whose objection to immigration is fiscal, is they're going to be a net tax consumer. So I'll say something like, so because of this, I shouldn't be able to invite my cousin from Ireland who's in his 20s to come here and live with me to start with and go get a job because he might be a net tax burden. So you obviously believe then that you should control the decision, or the polity should control my decision of whether to procreate with my wife or anybody else. because I guarantee you that offspring is going to be a net tax consumer for at least 18 years, probably longer than that. That's a spillover. If all we're concerned about is the spillovers, let's be consistent. And almost nobody is willing to do that, which means I don't really think their objection to immigration is the fiscal effect necessarily. It's also the case, by the way, as you go across countries, the more heterogeneous the population, it tends to be the smaller the welfare state, because people are more willing to subsidize people who are like them or look like them. So I think it's actually a good, in terms of the Milton Friedman quote, it's a good constraint on the welfare state. So last thing, and then I'll take a couple questions before we wrap up on time, is, so what's the optimal number of immigrants then? I got no idea. What's the optimal number and mix of shoes in the Soviet Union? They had no idea. It's a problem of central planning. We need markets to figure this out. Last year I moved from Massachusetts to Texas. How did you know the optimal number of people to move from Massachusetts to Texas? Depending who you asked, the Texan might say everybody should move here, or they might say we don't want any of you to move here. But how do you find the optimal number? Well, I had an employer who was paying me there. I had a cost of living there. I had an employer bidding for my services in Texas and a cost of living there. I weigh these trade-offs against each other and figure out where can I create greatest value and enjoy it most myself. Move to Texas. Other people made choices in the other direction. We basically figure out what the optimal number of migrants between US states is by letting people bid on their services and cost of living adjustments and other personal things that matter to you too. So I had to leave like Red Sox Nation, so that was like hard. That's like someone leaving their home country to go to another country. Within the United States, welfare state decisions don't distort that very much. If we went to complete open borders in the world right now, probably more people would move here than is optimal, because the differences in welfare state between the United States and them is a distortionary effect. But I bet you it would be a lot more close to what the correct number is than what the current restrictive policy is. So basically, I don't know the optimal quantity. We need a market process to find it, which means we need to internalize as many of the cost of existence once you get here as possible, and then let people freely move here. And I don't mean to say sequenced. We need to let people freely move here, provided they think that that's the best option for them, as long as they're not taken from us. So we need a market to find it. So with that, let's have questions about this one or any other lecture. Yeah?
You mentioned remittances that they might send back to their home country. Wouldn't that go against the idea that they would create more demand here? Wouldn't it reduce the amount of demand that they're creating? And how big would that be?
So two parts to the answer. If it was true, that would be awesome, because we'd send them pieces of paper that just stay in their country and we got their services. Unfortunately, it's not true. So one thing that's going to happen is it can impact the exchange rates between the countries, which then change the flow of goods and services between the two, and you can cancel it all out. Indirectly, basically, it comes back to the United States, one way or another. Other than some money that's held overseas for, illicit transactions and speculatory hoarding or whatever, but to the extent that they spend, it makes its way back here. But it would be cool if it didn't. Other questions? Seriously? Yeah.
So one of the things in terms of wages and child labor laws, when I debate liberals about it, they seem to think that if you get rid of the child labor laws in the United States, that suddenly we're going to have a lot of children working in plants here. So what would you respond to that?
Yeah, I've got a 3.5-year-old right now. I'd like them to go out and make me like $3 an hour. And then when the person snickers, then I'd be like, yeah, that's how absurd what you just said was. No, seriously, if I was going to give a more legit, actually I probably would say that first, but a more legit answer is that if you look at this, a decent amount of scholarship on it, some of the names are escaping me at the moment, that basically study the transition from 1900 to about 1940 in child labor in the United States in response to states passing child labor laws, and basically find that there's no net effect on child employment rates as these laws are passed, partly because they're codifying what's already happening and partly because they're ignored. And then there's a second strand of economic, actually Bob, you might know some of this, the authors in the economic history literature on school enrollment and mandatory school enrollment laws at that time, which implicitly would be taking them out of the labor force. And again, finding basically, is it Golden who did some of that?
I'm forgetting the names myself.
Yeah, basically the two things they study, there's the adoption of labor laws and the mandatory school laws, and you basically don't get any effect of them in between that 1900 to 1940 time, which is the transition out of sweatshops time. Although I still like my first reaction better. Yeah?
Have you ever come across the argument for letting in immigration? So there's the cobweb model in labor theory economics, and saying that by allowing immigrants, it would distort that model because it would create an oversaturation of the market that can never correct itself based on open immigration. And I've only heard that from several conservatives, but they're also students, so I don't think it's quite a developed argument necessarily.
Yeah, I don't think I understand the argument.
Well, because the cobweb model is saying that the market creates that optimum level of payment. You know, anytime too many people enter a certain field, then the prices will drop, and then people leave that field, and the prices will go back and eventually get equilibrium. But
Yeah.
their argument is that by allowing immigrants in, it keeps an automatic or a lower bottom on that.
Yeah, they have their heads in the freaking sand. So actually, so one, it's implying that the immigrants come in and will always just stay in whatever job or field or whatever it is they came in on. So I think this is important when it comes to like guest worker programs and stuff, that you don't tie employment to a particular employer, that you give them flexibility to change. But also it's avoiding the historical norm of when you could cross the border more. Mexican immigration to the United States came in and went back, came in and went back. There were seasonal flows. It also booms and busts. When the United States economy is booming, more of them come in. When it busts, more of them go back. This latest downturn, fewer went back than would have in previous ones because they knew it was going to be so hard to get back in the United States. They are doing the cobweb effect then of kind of riding it out. But it's because we have these crazy border controls. If you go to European immigration in the 19th century, I think it's like 1 out of 3 Italian immigrants to the United States, something like that, went back to Italy eventually. So it's not even just a close border like Mexico where they're going back and forth. It's they come here, they work for a while, go back home. So I think it just ignores the reality that labor markets are flexible across international borders when politicians don't draw lines on maps that impede movement. Anything else? Yeah.
So I'm working on open borders with a friend. I don't know if you ever heard this argument, but he's actually a bit of a Malthusian, and he's concerned about like overpopulation and population density. And I mean, obviously that's related to a bunch of other, you know, forms of state intervention. But and then he also kind of levels these. So have you heard of like the demographic economic growth paradox and like how fertility rates are strongly correlated with economic development? He's almost like presenting like almost like racist argument that allowing immigrants from countries where they have cultural norms where they have more children or something is somehow going to affect economic development in the United States. He hasn't actually said that, but that's kind of like what I'm inferring from his argument.
Okay, so there's 2 parts to your question. Let me take the first one first because I actually understand it better. The Malthusian one of like, oh, we can't support these immigrants. Yeah. One, like, have you flown across the United States? Look out the window. There's lots of flyover country. Secondly, when we look around the world, some of the wealthiest places in the world are some of the most densely populated. So dense population doesn't equal poverty. The key is, for like a Malthusian world, you need like a fixed resource world or a no growth world. If we're in a Julian Simon world, where human creativity is kind of the ultimate resource, bring people in, you create more wealth, we make better use of the resources we have, and there's no Malthusian drag to this. So I disagree with the fundamental premise that it's going to deplete our resources, because I think it's going to unleash the resources that are constrained in humans that are trapped in poor countries right now. And we'll all become wealthier as a result in the long run of this. And the idea that we just have nowhere to put them is just ludicrous. At 300 million people and however many square miles the United States is, there's plenty of room and we can always go up. The second part about the outbreeding us or whatever, I'm not even sure how to define us. But so I guess what I'd ask though is, so what are the bad consequences from, so what? If it's true, which I'm not willing to concede is going to be true, because it is the case that as people become wealthier, they tend to have fewer children for a multitude of reasons. So I don't know why people of different races, as they become wealthier in the United States, wouldn't keep that same type of trend, rather than just, oh, because of their race they breed more or something like that. I don't get that argument. But even if so, as long as those people don't vote fundamentally differently for different institutions, we're still going to get wealthier of it. Yvonne, you want to jump in on this?
Well, that's actually, many conservatives have been bringing up this last point, right? Is that Hispanics, for example, we tend to vote predominantly Democratic, right? So if you care about liberty in this country, not the assumption that Republicans somehow protect liberty, which is nonsense. But they say that you will bring in all of these people that are going to permanently change the political dynamic in the country.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, one, I don't care about the Republicans, as you mentioned, versus the Democrats in protecting liberty. I think they're equal opportunity statists. But it's unclear to me over time and as I mentioned before, what little evidence that we do have on it so far doesn't show any correlation between greater immigrants and less economic freedom in the United States or in European countries. But sure, people can have lots of fears. So what I do support on this is more discussion about things like that, rather than sitting around and talking about jobs, wages, and the economy, because this is where the more interesting social science is to be done on it. Yeah?
So one of the arguments that my Keynesian friends use is that immigrants send their money back to their home countries, so they're not actually increasing demand here. So they're not buying stuff here because they're sending the money back. So.
Yeah, I already kind of addressed that. That it changes exchange rates and indirectly product flows here, so we're still going to get demand here. But it would be cool if they could send remittances back. Did you want to pipe in, Anthony?
Yeah, just a quick question. We had an Institute blog by Carl about this prison sterilization program, where some prisoners have been sterilized, perhaps questionably in terms of consent and all this. And there were a whole bunch of comments on Facebook about, this is great, extended to immigrants, extended to people on welfare, we should sterilize all these people. And I wonder if what you said about how we should be consistent, like if with the spillover effects, why don't we bar people from having kids then? I see that as a potentially frightening argument to make given the culture, but my question is, do you think that given the underlying reasons that a lot of people seem to really want to restrict immigration, that as important as these economic arguments are, how do we deal with that, or do we just write those people off? And do you think most of them are people that won't ever come around?
Yeah, I don't know about this. So I mostly argue as an economist, which is means and ends. So I ask people what their ends are, what are their objections to immigration, and to the extent I can show means ends irrationality, I hope to convert things. We can also argue with people about what's right and what's wrong. But I'll tell you, I had one former colleague who bought all of he was an economist. He bought all the economics to it, and what it boiled down to, quite frankly, is I don't want to have to push one for English. You're not going to change his mind. Yeah.
When a lot of the immigrants come from Mexico, they bring their children that are too young to really know or consent to whether or not they want to go to America with their parents, and so they essentially grow up as Americans, but they're still illegal, and so they go through the education system, and some of them do get college degrees, but then they can't use it anywhere because you can't get a job as their status. So what do you think should be done about that?
So let me give the constrained answer to this question directly, and then the more broad one afterwards. So this actually affects someone in my family directly who's engaged to someone in this type of situation, who's got a college degree and is working on becoming a productive professional. For these kids who came in, for whatever anybody else's objection, for people who came in here illegally, for the kids who had no control of it, who have grown up Americans, to me this is a complete and utter no-brainer. Legalize them, let them work here. They're Americans as much as anyone else who grew up here. Now, to the illegal immigration problem more generally, there are few things in this world that have what a philosopher friend of mine calls a magic wand solution, where you can wave a magic wand and it disappears. I don't know how many people I have debated on immigration who's like, I have no problem with legal immigration. It's just illegal immigration that causes the problem here. There's a magic wand solution to this. You are now all legal. And anyone else who wants to come here is legal when you come here. We no longer have illegal immigration. That's a magic wand problem. There's very few of those in the world. And I would suggest that that's what we should be doing with the 11 million or so currently illegal immigrants that are here. And frankly, actually, just the reality check, while you might deport some or whatever, there is, for all the people like, oh, we have to get them all out, send them back to their country. There is going to be no practical way to deport 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States. It's time the de jure law just catches up with de facto what's already gone on. And it'll be better for the immigrants who are here, but it'll be better for the rest of us because they'll be able to better integrate into society, assimilate more, and create greater economic value for us. And essentially, by the way, on the question of assimilation, this cuts a little bit to the culture over time thing. I think mostly they assimilate just like prior generations do when you look at a lot of standard measures. But what they're assimilating to ideologically is not an individualist culture in the United States that was here in the 19th century. They're assimilating into a multiculturalist, statist culture of the United States. So the problem lies with our existing culture in the United States of the native-born population that we're effectively assimilating immigrants into. We're making them look like other Americans, and other Americans are status pigs. So our real battle is ideological within our own society. With that, I thank you, and I think you guys have announcements for him or something. Thanks.